So we're preparing ourselves for 3 days of prayer and fasting. And we didn't want to wait till next week to talk about that, but we wanted to give us a mindset starting today at the importance of this time that we have every year, the Psalm Assembly. Psalm Assembly is based on the book of Joel, chapter 1 and 2. And so next week we'll probably be dealing with that passage. But we, in keeping with our new way of doing the scriptures, dealing with biblical characters, we went out of sync in terms of chronology, and we are now going to deal with the book of Esther. The book of Esther is an amazing, amazing book, and it's a very fascinating book because the name of God is not mentioned once, and the hero of the book is not a man, and it's not a religious leader. It's a woman who won a beauty contest. And it just shows you the way God can operate in the midst of natural order in ways that are behind the scenes and not just something that is overtly religious or even in the church. So we can understand God's ways as we examine this. This has 10 chapters. So it's going to be difficult to go through the whole book in one day. So what I'm doing is I'm going to go through snippets of the book that will show us in 7 movements the outline of Esther. And so the objective today is we want to encourage the church to understand the power of fasting and prayer to change challenging situations. Some key questions to ask yourself as this is being taught. Am I using my gifts and talents to influence my spheres of influence for God? So whatever natural gifts you have, Esther did not move in the gifts of the Spirit. She probably moved in a word of wisdom, but she had natural beauty that gave her access to power. Am I using my natural gifts and talents to influence my sphere? What sphere are you in? Are you influencing that for God? Another question to ask yourself, do I have a mature believer helping me and mentoring me and speaking biblical truth into my life? Esther had someone by the name of Mordecai who brought her up. And if it wasn't for Mordecai, the Jews probably would have been exterminated, as you will see in this book. Another question, do I understand why God has called me to his kingdom for such a time as this? Why did God call you into his kingdom now and not 20 years ago, 40 years ago, or 200 years ago? This is a historical account that took place sometime between 485 and 465 BC during the reign of Persian king Artaxerxes. There are other translations that use the other name. This is the Greek name, Artaxerxes. But while this was taking place, we see Ezra and Nehemiah focused on rebuilding Jerusalem on the wall and the temple. Esther was at the same time one of the remnant Jews living as an exile in Persia. So Babylon ransacked Jerusalem in the 6th century, the late 580s, like 589 BC. And while that was taking place, Jews were taken exile into Babylon. Then Persia became the predominant empire. And during the Persian exile of the Jews, which is modern day Iran, by the way, Esther was one of the remnant Jews. And the other accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah were taking place in Jerusalem. So this is all around the same time. This is where you understand how the books of the Bible line up. And so God used a woman, a non-religious leader, to deliver his people in this book. So as I said, we're going to go through this book in 7 movements. It's almost like a Broadway play, a drama. And we're going to go to the first movement. Movement 1, Queen Vashti refuses to obey the king. It says in Esther chapter 1, starting with verse 10, on the 7th day when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king to bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this time the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So, for whatever reason, she refused to come. Most of the times when people talk about this, they talk about her being disobedient to the king. My take on it is perhaps she was correct in not wanting to be objectified by the king because of her beauty. But whatever reason, God used this heroic stance of Vashti to make room for another queen strategically placed to save God's people. So she felt uncomfortable being gawked at because of her beauty, refused to listen to the king. It may not have been the wisest thing to do, but God used it. And what was the penalty for disobeying the king? This is still movement 1, verse 19. It says that one of his men came, said, "Please let the king issue a royal order, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is to never again come before the king. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she." And so her position as queen was removed. It didn't say she was executed, but she was no longer able to appear before the king. So probably she was just in exile, living a life of isolation, which was a horrible fate. Movement 2, the contest to choose another queen, starting with chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the anger of the king had abated, the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel. And let their cosmetics be given to them. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Part of movement 2, Esther enters the beauty contest. It doesn't say Mordecai entered her. It says she was taken into the citadel, so perhaps by force they took all the beautiful women. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Now you're going to see Mordecai is the real hero of this story, who mentored and encouraged Esther. So you could say they both shared the spotlight in this story. And interesting story of redemption here, because it says that he was the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And if you look at the accounts in 2 Samuel, Shimei was the one who cursed David and pelted him with stones when Absalom tried to take the kingdom, and he was fleeing from his son because he was of the tribe of Saul, the king, whom David replaced. And so you see the hero is someone who is related to a person who was cursed and executed by David, actually by Solomon, his son. You find that in 1 Kings. So God can break generational curses and use our descendants in a powerful way, even if we ourselves mess up. So that's good news. So Mordecai descended from Shimei, and he was bringing up Hadassah. I love that name, Hadassah. And Hadassah is the woman whose name was changed to Esther by the Persians. She was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. She had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict was proclaimed, many women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of one of the eunuchs, and Esther was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of the eunuch who had charge of the woman. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. Same movement, chapter 2, verse 15. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants, and it was Esther's feast. Up to this point, nobody in the kingdom but Mordecai knew that Esther was a Jew. Mordecai wisely commanded her not to disclose her origins. So he had a sense from God that she had to keep this very quiet. And he didn't know why at this point. Sometimes God gives us a sense of something before we know why, and we have to go by that. So Esther was amazingly placed in a strategic position with access to the most important man in Persia and in the world at that point, just because she won a beauty contest. So she won the Miss Iran contest, basically. This also shows us that God has given his people access to power, even people that are hidden that we don't know about. And shows us how God could use even natural grace and ability to be a champion for him. So Esther won the Miss Iran contest. Somebody else can win the Nobel Peace Prize or become an innovative scientist or innovator in terms of technology, or they could be a principal who turns around a school, or some kind of sports hero, musician. It could be anything that God uses in our natural ability to give us access and a platform. Movement 3. So we see Esther won the beauty contest. Behind the scenes is Mordecai coaching her, telling her what to do. Now we're going to find out who Mordecai was. Movement 3, we find that Mordecai was, actually we already know who Mordecai was. We want to see what Mordecai did, actually. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, usually someone who sits at the king's gate is somebody who is an official, a public official. We don't know if he was an official at that point or he was just smart enough to have proximity to power. He wanted to know what was going on. That's more likely what was happening. It would be like people who hang out near the White House or in places of Congress. Even there are public places you could go and you could stay even if you're not an official. So there's probably something like that. So he was sitting at the king's gate, and he overheard 2 of the king's eunuchs plot to kill the king. And Mordecai told Esther, who then told the king. And when the affair was investigated and found to be true, the men were both hanged at the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the presence of the king. So here we have 2 major things take place. 1, 3. I want you to see how God does stuff. How God does things behind the scenes. 1, Vashti refuses to come before the king. Number 2, Esther becomes queen in her place. Number 3, Mordecai overhears a plot to kill the king. Why is all that important? Because we see how God orchestrates things in our life in our nation to set up transformation. Movement 4. Haman has a plot to exterminate the Jews. Chapter 3, verse 1 to 11. Now we see since the days of Egypt, there have been numerous attempts to exterminate God's people. We even see that going on today in North Africa, in the Middle East, China, and India. The governments are cracking down, or there are factions, whether by ISIS or other factions of extremists trying to wipe out the church. So there's always been these kind of plots of genocide against God's people, whether they be Jews or Christians. And it says, after these things, what things? After Vashti was removed, Queen Esther was put in her place, Mordecai uncovered a plot. After these things, someone say after these things.
After these things.
Not a coincidence. The king promoted Haman the Agagite. And he advanced him and set his throne above all the officials that were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to him. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But, I love this, Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. He refused to do so because he was a Jew. And they put no other gods before the one true God. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, he was filled with fury. But he decided not to lay hands on Mordecai alone, because they made known to him that the reason why he didn't bow down was because he was a Jew. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, not just Mordecai. He wanted to kill all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Persia. And so he goes and tells the king, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, meaning bow down to him, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. Of course, he left that part out. That's the only thing they didn't listen to. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it in the king's treasury. So basically, he was paying people to kill the Jews. So the king took his signet ring off his hand, gave it to Haman, told him the money's given to you and your people to do as seems good. Letters were brought by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to kill and to annihilate the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods, not only to kill them, but to take their house, their money, everything. And so we see God's hand here. Before Haman was given his power, all these other things took place. What is movement 5? The response of Mordecai and Esther, chapter 4, verse 1 to 3, then 7, from 7 to 17. So we've been through 4 movements. Remember, Queen Vashti just deposed as queen. Esther takes her place. We understand who Mordecai is in movement 3. We understand how Mordecai uncovered a plot to kill the king. And then we see in movement 4 how Haman was exalted, and because Mordecai refused to bow down to him, Haman devised a plan, changed public policy, used laws by his access to the king to, all this has to do with who has access to the king. Isn't that amazing? You could use that in the spiritual sense too. Because we have access to the king, we could change the king. The kings of the earth and all the people on the earth. And it's going to be done through fasting and prayer. And so Haman is exalted, passes a law through the king to exterminate the Jews. Now we're at movement 5. Again, chapter 4, verse 1 to 3, then 7 to 17. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes And he put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, but nobody was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. You couldn't be in mourning when you're at the king's gate, because when you're in the king's gate, you have to show respect and joy and peace, because, you trust in the king. But he went in the king's gate with sackcloth, which showed that he was in mourning. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decrees reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So even though the name of God is not mentioned, we see God implied through the fasting and the prayer. Then Mordecai sent word to Esther and explained to her and commanded her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Esther spoke to Mordecai through her eunuch and said, all the king's servants and the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called by the king, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to the king these 30 days. In other words, Esther was afraid for her life. Unless the king called for somebody, if anyone dare go in the inner chamber where the king resided, he would be put to death instantly. Now listen to this answer by Mordecai. This should be hanging on walls. I love this answer. Then Mordecai told Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any other of the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. But who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. In other words, Mordecai interpreted all that had been orchestrated, and he immediately knew that the reason why she won that beauty contest and the reason why she found favor in the eyes of the king was not because she was the prettiest girl in the country, that could have been, but it was because the Jews needed an advocate who could speak on their behalf. You see how God sets things up? It's amazing. And so Esther then replied, okay, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa. Hold a fast on my behalf. Everything is fasting, prayer, fasting, prayer. All the things we see in our nation, we should be fasting and praying like never before. What we see going on in this country, in our community, with our own families. And she said, do not eat or drink for 3 days. They didn't even have water. So we at least drink water or have juice. They didn't have water or food, night and day. And she said, I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And listen to this, if I perish, I perish. Wow. She fully surrendered herself into her destiny into God's hands. Esther didn't know how it would turn out, but she was willing to die to do what was right. This is the kind of disciples of Christ we need. And so this compelling narrative shows us a combination of fasting, prayer, and having access to power. As we will see in these movements, sometimes fasting and prayer is not enough. Sometimes we also have to change the law. So it was fasting, prayer. It wasn't just repentance. But that fasting and prayer necessitated action of God's people. So it wasn't just fasting and prayer. It was now using our access to power to change the law. That's why we have to pray for Christians that are in government, that are in politics, that have access to power, so that they can enact right laws. So it's not just prayer and fasting, but prayer and fasting gives us the access, gives us the power, gives us the wisdom, gives us the know-how, and has God moving in our behalf. But we also have to change the laws. You see the balance here. This is such an amazing book. So I believe in activating the church in fasting and prayer, but I also believe in activating the church and getting involved in the community, getting involved in politics, economics, community leadership. It's all part of God's plan. So, on the night and the days when they were fasting and prayer, now it gets better. Listen to this. On that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So he must have had a dream or some sense. Read the Chronicles. Read the Chronicles. And it was found how Mordecai had uncovered the plot of these two eunuchs and sought to kill the king. And the king said, what honor or distinction had been bestowed on Mordecai for this? That was another thing God stopped. Even though Esther told the king about the plot and they wrote it down in the Chronicles, for some reason the king never honored him at that point. So even the point of elevation is left to God's timing. And so no honor was given to him. And as a result of this, the king went and got Mordecai. And it's so funny, as you read the story, we won't have time to read it. Haman, at the same time he was reading the Chronicles and found out Mordecai saved his life, Haman was walking into the king's chamber. And the king said, okay, call him in. And he asked Haman, what shall the king do for a man who pleases him? How should the king honor such a man? And Haman thought, well, who is pleasing the king more than I? So he thought the king wanted to bestow honor on him. And so he said, well, you should clothe this man with robes, purple robes that you wore. You should put your signet ring on him. You should have someone take him around in a chariot and go before him and say, this is what is done for a man who pleases the king. And at that point, Haman's wife and friends had advised him to erect a gallows in front of Haman's house. And he was going in to tell the king to hang Mordecai. And right before Mordecai was going to be executed, the king, who didn't know about this, had a dream to look at the Chronicles, and he wound up reading that Mordecai saved his life. So at the moment Haman came in, and the young men had told the king about what Mordecai did, Haman tells the king how to honor Mordecai, but he thought it was for himself. Hysterical. So then the king says, okay, everything you just said, do for Mordecai. Mordecai was about to be hanged. Now he was honored because he was a man of God, because he sought the Lord, because they prayed and they fasted. And so Haman took him around the city, honoring him. And he ran into his house after it was over, hiding his head, and his wife said, know that if this man is a Jew, that you're going to fall before him very shortly. And in the meantime, Esther, after fasting and praying, I guess she got a word of wisdom what to do, and she asked the king. She actually went before the king. The king put his scepter out in front of her, allowed her entrance. He said, I'll give you anything you want, even up to half my kingdom. And she said, if it please the king, have you and Haman come to a feast I've prepared for the both of you later on. So that night, the king went to this feast. King went up to Esther and said, okay, what do you want? She said, if it please the king, I'll let you know tomorrow. I have another feast prepared. Please come with Haman. So Haman was all excited. He thought, wow, I'm being honored again. Now this time Esther is honoring me. And so, movement 6. This is incredible. The king and Haman went to the feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said, what is your wish? What is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have been silent. But our affliction is not to be compared with this loss to the king. Then the king said to Queen Esther, who is he? Who is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king was so furious at Haman, he went to decompress in the palace garden. And while he was out, Haman began begging for his life to Queen Esther. And at one point, he fell on Esther while she was sitting on the couch. So he was literally on the couch with Esther when the king happened to walk in. And it looked like he was assaulting Esther. And the king said, will you assault the queen in my presence and in my palace? And then that very night, they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Unbelievable. See how God was able to reverse the plans of the enemy and make it backfire on him instead. You see how this was an answer to prayer. This was an answer to fasting. What can God do for our nation? He's the same God. He's the same God. Because he's the same God, there are things that he wants to do now. And we could say the same thing. We've come into the kingdom. Say, I've come into the kingdom. For such a time as this. I'm called to use my influence, my talent, and my access to the King of Kings to change my world. Nowadays we have a movement in the church, prayer. There's a lot of there's houses of prayer. There's a lot of prayer movements, but unfortunately, a lot of the houses of prayer are focused on themselves, soaking, renewal, but they're not focused on interceding for the nation. A friend of mine had a house of prayer for 5 years in Portland. And he said it was transforming Portland. And then the whole thing switched around the last year, and it started to become self-focused on soaking for them, for their good, for their strength, for their renewal. And he said within a year, the whole thing died. If you remember, in 2 Samuel, we find how David, after he became king, set up the tent that had the Ark of the Covenant. He set it up right near the palace where he ruled. The presence of God went with government, and he won all of his battles, all his fights, because they were praying and combining worship and prayer with warfare for advancing the kingdom of God. when we come together, Paul says the first thing we ought to do is prayers and supplication. Go forth for kings and for all in authority, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and honesty, so that the gospel can go forth. That's 1 Timothy 2, verse 1 to 4. And so, there's more to this story. We could read how Mordecai was eventually second in command. He was lifted up. All the people who wanted to kill the Jews themselves. Now, it wasn't just Haman. Evidently, there was a plot, his sons, and there was 50 to 75,000 people who were going to be involved in annihilating the Jews, because one man couldn't do it all. And everything turned against all these people. And it says that the fear of Mordecai and the fear of the Jews went all of Persia, so that people even may believe they were Jews. They went from the minority to the most powerful, all because somebody fasted and prayed, and somebody obeyed God, who was willing to risk their life. And God honors that. God gets excited when people are willing to die to further his kingdom. When the church is filled with self-focused people that only want, as Esther's initial response was, I'm okay. I'm not risking my life. The king didn't call me. I'm not coming in. Self-focused Christianity. I'm with the king, so I don't have to risk my life. God is not pleased with that. He's pleased with those who are willing to further his kingdom, even if it means their life, their very life. And so, with everything going on today in our nation, if we couldn't fast and pray for 3 days, I don't know if we can't fast and pray and sign up before we leave to fast and pray. If we can't do that now, I don't know what we're waiting for. Right now, you say, well, I'm at peace, I'm in safety, I have my job, I have my pension, I'm okay, my kids are all right, my wife and I, we're still together. Sometimes God tests you more when things are going good to see if you will obey him. And so, let's not be like Esther's initial response. I'm good. I'm with the king. I'm in the palace. I'm safe. I'm cool. Mordecai's answer, you hold your peace. Deliverance will come from somewhere else. Yeah. Did you know that you came into the kingdom for such a time as this? So, what we're going to do is we're going to stand up and we're going to hold hands. And we're going to begin crying out to God right now for our nation.